The evening was crisp, with a hint of rain in the air as the man approached the hotel. His coat clung tightly to him, shielding him from the chill, but nothing could prepare him for the storm brewing inside. He had been traveling all day, his legs weary from the miles covered and his spirit longing for a moment of peace. The hotel, with its glowing sign promising comfort and refuge, seemed like a beacon in the night. Little did he know, the warmth he sought would soon be overshadowed by an experience that would leave an indelible mark not just on him, but on everyone who would later hear his story. The lobby buzzed faintly with the sound of soft jazz and murmured conversations, an oasis of calm compared to the bustling streets outside. As he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking softly on the marble floor, he felt a sense of relief. The faint aroma of fresh coffee and the sight of a plush armchair near the fireplace whispered of comfort, of respite. He approached the front desk, his expression polite yet tired, as he offered a small smile to the young woman typing away behind the counter. She didn't look up right away, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. When she finally glanced up, her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place: hesitation, perhaps? Or something deeper? "I have a reservation," he began, his voice steady but kind, as he slid his ID across the counter. The woman hesitated again, glancing at the screen and then back at him. A moment stretched into two, the silence growing thicker. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "We don't have any rooms available." The words hit him like a slap. His brows furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "I made a reservation. It should be in the system. Can you check again?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder at a man standing a few feet away. He was older, with sharp features and an air of authority. The manager. Their eyes met briefly before he nodded, stepping forward with a calm yet calculated expression. "What seems to be the issue here?" the manager asked, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone of finality. The guest explained, his words calm yet edged with growing frustration. The manager barely looked at the computer screen before shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone devoid of empathy. "We can't accommodate you tonight." It wasn't the words that stung the most, it was the way they were delivered, curt, dismissive, as though his presence itself was an inconvenience. The man felt a knot tightening in his chest. Something was off. He had stayed in countless hotels before and never encountered this kind of treatment. He glanced around, noting the other guests moving freely through the lobby, checking in without issue. His reservation had been confirmed days ago. Why was he suddenly being turned away? He decided to press further. "I have my confirmation email right here," he said, pulling out his phone and holding it up for them to see. The manager's eyes barely flicked to the screen before he raised a hand. "That won't be necessary," he said, his tone sharper now. "I've already explained we're fully booked." "But I see people checking in right now," the man countered, his voice rising slightly, though still controlled. "Why am I being denied a room?" The manager's expression shifted, his calm veneer cracking ever so slightly. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Sir, I don't think this is the kind of place for you." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. The man blinked, stunned into silence. What did that mean? His mind raced, his thoughts spiraling into anger and disbelief. Was it his appearance? The color of his skin? He had hoped, perhaps naively, that such blatant discrimination was a relic of the past. But here it was, staring him in the face, cloaked in polite words but cutting just as deep. A part of him wanted to walk away, to leave and find another place to stay. But another part of him, the part that refused to back down in the face of injustice, rooted him to the spot. He looked the manager square in the eye, his voice steady but laced with steel. "I'd like to speak to someone else. Maybe the owner." The manager's lips curved into a thin, humorless smile. I am the owner. For a moment, the room seemed to close in around him. He glanced at the receptionist, who now seemed uncomfortable, her eyes darting anywhere but toward him. The hum of conversation in the lobby seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of his heart in his ears. He knew he was being tested, pushed to his limit. But he also knew that walking away would mean letting this moment pass without challenging it. And that wasn't an option. The man straightened his posture, his resolve hardening. If that's the case, he said, his voice unwavering, then you should know I won't let this go. The manager's smile faltered, just slightly, as if he hadn't expected resistance. But before either of them could say another word, something happened. A guest who had been standing nearby stepped forward, their voice cutting through the tension. Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. What they said next would send shockwaves through the room, flipping the narrative in a way no one could have anticipated. The guest who stepped forward was a woman, mid-30s maybe, dressed in a business suit that suggested she was no stranger to demanding situations. She had been standing off to the side with her suitcase, apparently waiting for her own check-in, but now she seemed compelled to intervene. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable firmness to it. I couldn't help but notice what's going on here, she said, directing her words at the manager but casting a quick, sympathetic glance at the man. It's pretty clear there's more to this situation than you're letting on. The manager's demeanor shifted slightly, though he tried to maintain his composed exterior. He gave her a tight smile, the kind you offer when you're annoyed but don't want to show it. This doesn't concern you, ma'am, he said coolly. We're simply experiencing a capacity issue tonight. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with his response. Capacity issue? She repeated, her tone sharp. Because I just heard you telling the gentleman that this isn't the kind of place for him. What exactly does that mean? The room seemed to hold its breath. The man, still standing at the desk, felt a mix of gratitude and unease. He wasn't sure who this woman was or why she was stepping in, but her support, unexpected as it was, gave him a renewed sense of determination. The manager hesitated, his mask of professionalism slipping just a little. As I said, he replied, his voice more measured now, we're fully booked, and I don't appreciate accusations being thrown around. Fully booked? The woman countered, not missing a beat. Funny, because I reserved a room just an hour ago, and you confirmed it without hesitation. So unless something changed in the last 5 minutes, I'm having a hard time believing that's the issue. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The man couldn't help but notice how the receptionist's expression shifted. Was that guilt? Nervousness? She seemed to shrink further into herself, avoiding eye contact with everyone now. The manager opened his mouth as if to respond, but before he could, another voice joined the conversation. This time it came from behind the desk, from an older gentleman who had just emerged from a back office. He was dressed in a plain shirt and tie, his demeanor quieter, almost unassuming, but there was an undeniable weight to his presence. He looked at the manager with a hint of confusion, then turned his gaze to the man standing at the counter. What's going on here? The older man asked, his voice calm but direct. The manager stiffened, clearly caught off guard. It's nothing, sir, he said quickly. Just a small misunderstanding with a guest. I've already explained that we're at full capacity. The older man frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked from the manager to the receptionist, then finally to the man. There was a moment of silence, as if he were piecing things together. Is that true? He asked the guest directly. Do you have a reservation? Yes, I do, the man replied, his voice steady despite the tension simmering beneath it. I even showed them my confirmation email, but I was told there's no room for me. And then your manager. He hesitated, glancing at the woman who had stepped in before continuing. Your manager suggested that I don't belong here. The older man's expression darkened, and a palpable shift occurred in the room. It was clear he wasn't pleased with what he was hearing. "Let me see that email," he said, his tone more of a command than a request. The man handed over his phone, and the older gentleman took it, scanning the screen quickly. His jaw tightened as he read, and when he looked up, his eyes were sharp, almost accusing, as they landed on the manager. "This is a confirmed reservation," he said firmly. "There's no reason this guest shouldn't be accommodated." The manager opened his mouth to protest, but the older man held up a hand, silencing him. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. He turned to the receptionist. "Check him in. Now." The receptionist, clearly relieved to have a directive, nodded quickly and began typing on her keyboard. The man felt a small wave of relief, though it was tempered by the lingering frustration of everything that had transpired. But just as he thought the situation might finally be resolved, the manager spoke again, his tone quieter but no less biting. "With all due respect, sir," he said, addressing the older man, "this isn't about the reservation. It's about maintaining the kind of environment our guests expect." The room went silent again. The older gentleman stared at the manager, his expression unreadable. "And what kind of environment is that?" he asked slowly, his voice deceptively calm. The manager hesitated, clearly realizing he had overstepped. "I just mean," he began, his words faltering, "we have a certain reputation to uphold." Before he could finish, the older man cut him off. "A reputation for turning away paying customers based on their appearance? Is that what you're saying?" The manager's face flushed, and he looked away, clearly flustered. The woman who had spoken up earlier folded her arms, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Exactly what I thought," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. The older gentleman sighed, turning back to the man. "I want to apologize for what's happened here tonight," he said sincerely. "This is not how we conduct business, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." The man nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but before he could respond, the older gentleman turned to the manager. "You and I will be having a conversation about this," he said firmly. "But for now, I suggest you step away from the desk." The manager hesitated, his pride clearly wounded, but he nodded stiffly and stepped back. The tension in the room began to ease, but the man couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. There was still an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something deeper was at play. As the receptionist finished processing his check-in, the man couldn't help but glance at the woman who had stepped in earlier. She caught his eye and offered a small smile, as if to say, "You're not alone in this." He nodded in silent gratitude, but the questions swirling in his mind refused to settle. Why had this happened? Was it really just about prejudice, or was there something more going on? And why did the manager seem so intent on keeping him out? He had a feeling he hadn't seen the last of that man and that this story was far from over. As the receptionist handed over his room key, the man felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, yes, but also anger, confusion, and a lingering sense of unease. He thanked her quietly and turned toward the elevators, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. He could sense the other guests watching, their curiosity palpable, though most quickly looked away when he glanced in their direction. Only the woman who had spoken up earlier held his gaze. She gave him a small nod, and though he didn't know her, that gesture felt like an anchor in the turbulent storm of emotions swirling inside him. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, cutting off the hum of the lobby and replacing it with silence. He leaned back against the wall, exhaling deeply. The encounter at the front desk replayed in his mind like a loop, each moment digging deeper into his nerves. He had been turned away for no reason other than who he was, or, at least, that was how it felt. The manager's words, his tone, and even the way he'd avoided eye contact all pointed to something undeniable. But why? And what did the older gentleman mean when he said he'd handle it? The elevator dinged softly as it arrived at his floor. He stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, where the plush carpet muffled his footsteps. The weight of the keycard felt heavier than it should as he found his room and slid it into the lock. The door clicked open, revealing a modest but comfortable space, a neatly made bed, a small desk by the window, and soft lighting that cast a warm glow over everything. Normally, he would have been grateful for the quiet, for the chance to decompress after a long day. But now, the silence felt oppressive, almost suffocating. He set his suitcase by the bed and sat down, his head in his hands. He didn't want to let this incident ruin his night, but it gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. Why had the manager been so determined to keep him out? And why had the older man, who clearly had authority, seemed so taken aback by the whole situation? It was almost as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened here. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He frowned, hesitating for a moment before getting up to answer it. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see the woman from the lobby standing there, her expression cautious but kind. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, holding up her hands as if to show she meant no harm. I couldn't leave without making sure you were okay." He blinked, taken aback by her sincerity. "I'm fine," he said after a moment, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Thank you? You didn't have to do that." She smiled faintly. "I know. But I couldn't just stand by and watch that happen. What they did to you, it wasn't right." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. She hesitated briefly but then nodded, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. They stood there for a moment, the awkwardness of two strangers sharing a space settling between them. "I don't mean to pry," she said finally, "but I've stayed at a lot of hotels, and I've never seen anything like that. That manager, he was out of line." "You don't have to tell me," the man replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I just don't understand why. It wasn't like I caused a scene or anything. I walked in, I showed my ID, and suddenly I wasn't welcome." The woman nodded, her brow furrowing as if she were piecing together a puzzle. "Did you notice how nervous the receptionist looked?" She knew something wasn't right, but she didn't say a word. He had noticed. Her reluctance to make eye contact, the way her hands had trembled slightly as she typed, it all pointed to someone caught in a situation they couldn't control. "You think she knew why he was doing it?" he asked. "I think she's seen it before," the woman replied. "Maybe not exactly this, but something like it. And that older guy, the one who came out of the office, he seemed pretty upset. It's like this isn't the first time he's had to deal with something like this." The man considered her words, a strange sense of unease creeping over him. Was it possible that this wasn't an isolated incident? Could the manager have a pattern of targeting certain guests, hiding it behind vague excuses about capacity or policy? The thought made his stomach churn. He wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions, but after what he just experienced, it was hard not to wonder. "Why do you care?" he asked suddenly, his tone more curious than accusatory. Most people would have just walked away. The woman shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe I've seen too much of this kind of thing before. People being treated differently for no good reason. It's not right, and if no one speaks up, it just keeps happening." She paused, then added softly and honestly, "I hate bullies." "That manager? He's a bully." Her words struck a chord with him. He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thanks," he said, "for stepping in back there. You didn't have to, but I appreciate it." She smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "You're welcome. And for what it's worth, I think you handled it better than most people would have. You kept your cool." They talked for a little while longer, sharing stories about their travels and the small, everyday injustices they'd encountered along the way. It was strange, but comforting, to find an ally in a stranger. When she finally left, promising to check in on him the next day, he felt a little less alone. But as the door closed behind her, the questions returned, heavier than ever. He knew he couldn't just let this go. Something about the manager's behavior, the way he tried to dismiss him so quickly, didn't sit right. And then there was the older man, the one who'd stepped in to make things right. Who was he really? And how much did he know about what was going on here? As the night wore on, he found himself pacing the room, his thoughts racing. The memory of the manager's words replayed in his mind. This isn't the kind of place for you. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became to get to the bottom of it. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about him. It felt bigger than that, like he'd stumbled onto something that had been hidden just beneath the surface. He didn't know what he would do next, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, he woke up with a sense of resolve. The sun streamed through the thin curtains, but the brightness did little to ease the tension that had built overnight. Sleep had been fitful at best, with his thoughts swirling endlessly around the events in the lobby. There was something wrong with this place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on yet, and he knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he figured it out. He got dressed and headed downstairs, his steps purposeful. The lobby was quieter now, with only a few guests milling about. The receptionist from the night before was back at her station, looking even more uneasy than she had before. Her eyes darted up when she saw him, and for a split second, there was something in her expression, a mix of guilt and worry, that made him pause. "Good morning," he said evenly as he approached the desk. She straightened up, her hands fidgeting nervously. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I just wanted to thank you for getting me checked in last night," he said, keeping his tone neutral. It couldn't have been easy with everything going on. Her eyes flickered toward the office door behind her, and she lowered her voice. "I'm really sorry about what happened," she said, her words rushed and quiet. "I didn't know what to do. Before she could finish, the door to the back office opened, and the older gentleman from the night before stepped out. He glanced at the receptionist, then at the man, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," the older man said, his tone calm but firm. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" The man nodded, following him into the office. The room was small and unremarkable, with a desk cluttered with papers and a single chair in front of it. The older man gestured for him to sit, then closed the door. "I wanted to apologize again for what happened last night," he began, sitting down across from him. "That kind of behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you, it's being addressed." "Is it?" the man asked, his voice steady but pointed. "Because it didn't feel like the first time something like that's happened here." The older man hesitated, his hands folding together on the desk. "You're not wrong," he admitted after a moment. "There have been incidents. But I want you to know that we take them seriously." "What kind of incidents?" the man pressed. "Because that manager didn't seem like he was just having a bad day. He knew exactly what he was doing." The older man sighed, his expression heavy. "This is a family-owned hotel," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's been in my family for generations. I've always tried to run it the right way, to make it a place where everyone feels welcome. But not everyone shares that vision." "You mean your manager?" the man said, the words more of a statement than a question. The older man nodded. "He's my nephew," he said reluctantly. "I brought him on to help with the business, but it's become clear that his attitudes don't align with our values. So why keep him around?" the man asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "If you know he's treating people like this, why not do something about it?" The older man looked away, his jaw tightening. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Family can be difficult." The man shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Complicated or not, it doesn't change what happened. He tried to turn me away because of how I look. And I guarantee I'm not the only one. The older man's shoulders slumped, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. You're right, he admitted quietly. And I'm sorry. I should have stepped in sooner. I should have. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Before either of them could respond, the door swung open, and the manager stepped in, his face flushed with anger. What's going on in here? The manager demanded, his voice loud and accusatory. Why are you meeting with him? The older man stood, his expression hardening. I'm trying to make things right, he said firmly. Something you should have done last night. The manager scoffed, crossing his arms. You're really going to take his side over your own family? This isn't about sides, the older man shot back. It's about doing what's right. You've crossed the line, and you know it. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. The man sat quietly, watching the two of them, his mind racing. He had come here looking for answers, but now he was caught in the middle of a family conflict that felt like it had been simmering for years. You don't understand, the manager said, his voice dropping lower. This isn't just about him. There's a reason I handle things the way I do. What reason? The older man demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like plain discrimination. The manager hesitated, his eyes darting toward the man before looking back at his uncle. You don't know what's been happening here. You don't see the kind of people who've been coming through. And what kind of people are those? The older man asked, his tone icy. The manager didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. The older man shook his head, a look of disappointment crossing his face. I've heard enough, he said. We'll talk about this later. The manager opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself, his face dark with resentment. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The older man sat back down, rubbing his temples. I'm sorry you had to witness that, he said, his voice heavy. I promise you, I'll handle this. The man nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. He appreciated the older man's sincerity, but the tension in the air was thick with unresolved issues. As he left the office and walked back toward the lobby, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. The manager's words had been cryptic, but there was something about his tone, something defensive, almost paranoid, that left the man uneasy. Later that day, as he sat in the small CF near the hotel, he spotted the woman from the night before. She waved him over, and he joined her at her table, grateful for the company. He told her about the conversation in the office. About the conflict between the older man and the manager. Sounds like there's more going on than they're letting on, she said, her expression thoughtful. Did you notice how the manager reacted when his uncle called him out? It's like he's hiding something. The man nodded. I don't know what it is, but it's bigger than me. There's something about this place, something they're not telling us. The woman leaned in, her voice lowering. Do you think it's worth digging into? Because I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface. He didn't answer right away, but he knew she was right. The truth was out there, just waiting to be uncovered. And whatever it was, he wasn't going to stop until he found it. He and the woman sat there in the CAF. A strange sense of unease began to settle over him. It wasn't just the unresolved tension with the manager or the heated exchange he'd witnessed in the office, it was something deeper, an almost instinctive feeling that something was off. He sipped his coffee, watching as hotel staff bustled in and out of the side entrance a few yards away. Most of them looked hurried, some looking over their shoulders as if they didn't want to be caught lingering too long. The woman noticed it too. You see that? She asked, tilting her head toward the door. It's like they're afraid of being seen. He nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together in his mind. You think this has something to do with last night? I don't know, she admitted, her voice thoughtful. But whatever it is, it's not just about you. This feels bigger. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them watching the staff as they came and went. The tension between the older man and the manager had seemed personal, but now it was clear that it extended beyond their family dynamic. There was a pattern here, one that he couldn't ignore. "What do we do?" he asked finally, turning to face her. She thought for a moment, then said, "We dig a little deeper. If there's something going on here, we need to find out what it is." He hesitated, unsure of how far he wanted to get involved. But the memory of the manager's cold dismissal, the way he tried to turn him away without a second thought, pushed him forward. "All right," he said. "But we need to be careful. If they're hiding something, they're not going to make it easy for us." They decided to start with the hotel staff. If anyone knew what was going on behind the scenes, it was the people working there. They spent the rest of the morning observing from a distance, watching the ebb and flow of employees. Eventually, they noticed a young housekeeper taking a break near the side entrance, her back against the wall and her phone in her hand. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped as she scrolled through her screen. The woman stood first, gesturing for him to follow her. "Let's see if she'll talk to us," she said quietly. As they approached, the housekeeper looked up, her expression wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "We don't mean to bother you," the woman said, her tone warm and reassuring. "We just had some questions about the hotel." The housekeeper frowned, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. "What kind of questions?" "About the manager," the man said, stepping forward. "And what's been happening here? You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but we're trying to understand." The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes darting toward the side door. "I can't talk about that," she said quickly, her voice low. "I need this job." "We understand," the woman said gently. "But if something's wrong, maybe we can help. You're not the first person to look like they're afraid of something or someone." For a moment, it seemed like the housekeeper might walk away. But then she sighed, tucking her phone into her pocket and leaning in slightly. "You didn't hear this from me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're not wrong. There's something going on here. The manager, he's involved in things he shouldn't be." "Like what?" the man asked, his heart pounding. The housekeeper shook her head. "I don't know all the details, but I've seen enough to know it's not good. There've been guest people like you who've been turned away for no reason. And then there are the deliveries." "Deliveries?" the woman pressed, her brow furrowing. The housekeeper hesitated again, glancing over her shoulder. "Late at night. Trucks coming in and out, people unloading boxes. We're not supposed to ask questions, but everyone knows something's not right." Before they could ask more, a voice called out from inside the door, sharp and authoritative. The housekeeper stiffened, her face paling. "I have to go," she said quickly, disappearing back inside before they could stop her. They stood there for a moment, processing what they just heard. The man's mind raced, the pieces clicking into place. The manager's behavior, the nervousness of the staff, the tension in the air, it all pointed to something much bigger than he'd realized. "What do you think the deliveries are?" the woman asked, her voice tinged with unease. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we need to find out." That night, they decided to keep watch. They found a spot near the back of the hotel, hidden by shadows but with a clear view of the loading dock. Hours passed, the stillness of the night broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps or muffled voices. Just as they were beginning to think nothing would happen, a truck pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. They watched as the driver climbed out, followed by two men who looked anything but friendly. They wore dark clothing, their movements brisk and purposeful as they began unloading boxes. The man's heart raced as he strained to see what was inside, but the angle made it impossible. What do we do? The woman whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer, his mind racing. They couldn't risk being seen, but they couldn't just walk away either. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than anything they'd imagined. And they were about to find themselves right in the middle of it. The truck's headlights illuminated the loading dock as the men continued their work, unloading box after box with a precision that suggested this wasn't their first time. The man and the woman crouched lower behind their hiding spot, hearts pounding as they tried to piece together what they were witnessing. There was an unmistakable tension in the air, as if they were on the verge of uncovering something far bigger than they'd anticipated. One of the men opened a box, revealing a glint of metal inside. It was hard to make out the details from their position, but the contents were clearly not standard hotel supplies. The woman nudged him, her eyes wide with alarm. They exchanged a look, unspoken agreement passing between them. It was time to act. They couldn't just sit there and watch anymore. Before they could decide their next move, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They froze, realizing too late that they'd been spotted. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing directly on them. "Who's there?" A voice barked, sharp and angry. The man stood slowly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The woman followed his lead, though her expression was tense. The flashlight lowered slightly, revealing the manager standing a few feet away, his face twisted in a mix of anger and panic. "What are you doing back here?" the manager demanded, his voice low but furious. "You have no idea what you're messing with." "We could ask you the same thing," the man shot back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "What's in those boxes? What are you hiding?" The manager's eyes flickered toward the truck, then back to them. For a moment, he looked like he might try to brush it off, but then his shoulders stiffened, and his expression hardened. "You don't understand," he said, his tone almost desperate. "This isn't what it looks like." "Then explain it," the woman said, stepping forward. "Because right now, it looks like you're running something illegal out of this hotel." The manager hesitated, his jaw clenching. "It's not illegal," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just business." "Business?" the man repeated, his voice incredulous. "You tried to turn me away last night, and now you're unloading trucks in the middle of the night. What kind of business is this?" Before the manager could respond, the older man appeared, his face pale as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The manager's expression shifted, a flicker of something almost like fear crossing his face. "Uncle," he said, his tone tight. "You shouldn't be here." The older man ignored him, stepping closer to the truck. His eyes widened as he saw the boxes, and his face fell. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think," the manager said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," the older man said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I trusted you, and this is how you repay me?" The manager opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, one of the men by the truck stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "We don't have time for this." The man and the woman exchanged a glance, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and it was clear that whatever was in those boxes, it was something worth protecting at any cost. "You need to leave," the man by the truck said, his gaze fixed on the older man. "Now." "I'm not going anywhere," the older man said firmly. "This is my hotel, and I have a right to know what's happening here." The man by the truck stepped closer, his hand moving toward his jacket. For a moment, it seemed like things were about to take a dangerous turn. But then the woman spoke up, her voice loud and clear. "If you don't stop, we'll call the police," she said, pulling out her phone. "Do you really want that?" The threat seemed to catch them off guard. The man by the truck hesitated, glancing at the manager, who looked equally unsure. The moment of uncertainty was enough for the older man to step forward, his voice rising. "This stops now," he said, his tone firm. "I don't care what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into. You're not dragging this hotel down with you." The manager looked like he wanted to argue, but the weight of his uncle's words seemed to sink in. He lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said quietly. "I thought I could handle it." The older man shook his head, his expression filled with both anger and sadness. "You should have come to me," he said. "We could have found another way." The tension in the air began to ease, but the man and the woman remained on edge. There was still too much they didn't know, too many unanswered questions. As the men by the truck began to retreat, the woman turned to the manager, her voice sharp. "This isn't over," she said. "Whatever you're hiding, people deserve to know the truth." The manager didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground. The man and the woman exchanged a glance, knowing they'd come as far as they could for now. But as they walked away, the man couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story, a final piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. It wasn't until they were back in the lobby that they noticed something strange. A small envelope had been slipped under the door of their room, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times. Inside was a single piece of paper, the handwriting hurried and almost illegible. "You don't know the whole truth. Be careful who you trust." The message sent a chill down his spine. Just when he thought the ordeal was over, another layer of mystery had revealed itself. And this time, it felt personal. The message in the envelope weighed heavily on him, a stark reminder that their journey wasn't over. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he held the paper in his hand, the words replaying in his mind. "Be careful who you trust." The warning felt ominous, as if it came from someone who knew more than they let on, someone who had been watching them from the shadows. He passed the note to the woman, who read it with furrowed brows. "It's a threat," she said quietly, though her voice carried conviction. "Or maybe it's a warning. Either way, it means we're closer to the truth than they want us to be." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "But who's they? The manager? The men unloading the truck? Or someone else we haven't even seen yet?" She exhaled slowly, folding the note and setting it on the bedside table. "We need to think this through. If we act without a plan, we're walking straight into a trap." For the rest of the night, sleep evaded them. They talked in hushed tones, going over every detail they had uncovered. The deliveries, the manager's desperation, the older man's disappointment, each piece seemed significant, but they still couldn't see the whole picture. Every time they thought they were close, another layer of mystery emerged, pulling them deeper. The next morning, they decided to confront the older man. If anyone could give them answers, it was him. They found him in the hotel's small garden, sitting on a bench with his hands folded in his lap. His expression was distant, his eyes fixed on the fountain in front of him. When they approached, he looked up, his face weary but kind. "I suppose you have more questions," he said softly, gesturing for them to sit. "We do," the man admitted, taking a seat beside him. "We found this last night." He handed the note to the older man, whose brow furrowed as he read it. The older man let out a long sigh, folding the note carefully and handing it back. "I was afraid of this," he said. "You've stumbled onto something dangerous, something I've been trying to stop for a long time." "Then tell us the truth," the woman said, her tone firm. "What's really going on here?" The older man hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "This hotel has been in my family for generations," he began. "It was built on trust, on community. But over the years, things changed. Business became harder, and my nephew, well, he thought he could fix everything. He got involved with people he shouldn't have. Who are these people? The man asked. Investors, the older man said, though the word carried a bitter edge. At least, that's what they called themselves. They offered money, connections, promises of turning the hotel into something grand. But their terms. They weren't clean. What do you mean? The woman pressed. The older man hesitated again, his gaze dropping to the ground. They started using the hotel for their own purposes, he admitted. At first, it was subtle. A few late-night meetings, special guests who didn't stay in the registry. But then the deliveries started. I confronted my nephew, but by then, it was too late. He'd signed contracts, made promises he couldn't break. And the trucks? The man asked, his voice tense. What's in those boxes? The older man shook his head. I don't know, he said honestly. They keep me in the dark. But I've seen enough to know it's not good. I've been trying to find a way to stop it, but every time I get close, they shut me out. The man and the woman exchanged a glance, the weight of the older man's words sinking in. It was clear he was caught in a web far more complex than they'd imagined, a web that now threatened to ensnare them as well. What about this note? The woman asked, holding it up. Who do you think sent it? The older man's expression darkened. Someone who's seen too much, he said. Maybe a staff member, maybe someone from their side who's starting to feel guilty. Either way, it means you're in danger. You need to leave. We can't just walk away, the man said firmly. Not now. If we do, they'll keep doing whatever they're doing, and you'll still be caught in the middle. The older man shook his head. You don't understand, he said, his voice rising slightly. These people don't play games. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their interests. If you stay, you're putting yourselves at risk. We know the risk, the woman said calmly. But if we don't do something, who will? The older man looked at them for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and admiration. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. But if you're going to fight this, you need to be smart. They've got power, connections. You'll need proof if you want to take them down. For the next few days, they worked in secret, gathering evidence. They watched the loading dock, took photos of the trucks and the men who unloaded them, and spoke quietly with staff members who were willing to talk. Each piece of information brought them closer to understanding the full scope of what was happening. The deliveries, they learned, were part of a larger operation, one that extended far beyond the hotel. But just as they thought they were getting close, the tension reached a boiling point. Late one night, as they reviewed their findings in their room, there was a loud knock at the door. They froze, their hearts racing as they exchanged a glance. The knock came again, harder this time. When the man opened the door, two men stood there, their expressions cold and unyielding. We need to talk, one of them said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The conversation that followed was brief but chilling. The men made it clear that they knew what the couple had been doing, and they didn't appreciate the interference. This is your one and only warning, one of them said, his voice low and dangerous. Leave now, or you'll regret it. As soon as the men left, the couple knew they had to act quickly. They gathered all the evidence they'd collected and left the hotel under cover of darkness, their hearts pounding as they drove away. The older man had been right, the people they were dealing with weren't the kind to back down easily. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light. They shared their findings with authorities, spoke to journalists who were willing to investigate, and used every resource they had to expose the operation. The process was slow and filled with setbacks, but eventually, their efforts paid off. The hotel became the center of a major investigation, and the operation that had been running behind the scenes was dismantled. The manager, facing mounting pressure, came forward with his own confession, providing key details that helped bring the perpetrators to justice. The older man, though shaken by the ordeal, vowed to rebuild the hotel and restore its reputation. As for the couple, they returned home with a sense of closure but also a deeper understanding of the risks they had taken. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also shown them the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what's right. In the end, the story wasn't just about a man being denied a room. It was about uncovering the truth, fighting for justice, and proving that even in the face of adversity, doing the right thing could make a difference. And though the journey had been anything but easy, they knew they wouldn't have done it any other way.